The child was about to lose her life, but her faithful canine German shepherd did what even medicine couldn't imagine. A little girl was on the brink of death. Doctors had given up, medicine had failed, and her family had lost hope. But just when everyone thought it was over, a canine German shepherd, her doctor's loyal companion, did something no one could explain. What happened next left even the most experienced doctor speechless. Stay until the end because this story will break your heart. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The hospital corridors were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that carried an unbearable weight. Dr. Michael Carter walked briskly through the pediatric ward, his mind clouded with thoughts he wished he could ignore. Room 407. He knew it too well. Inside, a 6-year-old girl lay on a hospital bed, her frail body barely moving. Her chest rose and fell in slow, shallow breaths. Lena Thompson had been battling a rare aggressive disease for over a year. Every treatment had failed. Every experimental drug had given only temporary relief before the illness came back stronger. Her parents, Emily and James, had exhausted every possible option, but the truth was undeniable. Now Lena was slipping away. Michael took a deep breath before pushing the door open. Inside, Emily sat by her daughter's side, her fingers gently stroking Lena's pale hand. Her eyes were red from sleepless nights and silent tears. James stood by the window, his fists clenched, his face carved with helplessness. "Dr. Carter," Emily whispered, looking up at him with desperate hope, as if maybe today he had come with a miracle. But he had none. Michael swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep his expression composed. "Her vitals are weakening. We're doing everything we can to keep her comfortable." Emily's face crumbled, her grip on Lena's hand tightening. "There has to be something, anything." James turned around abruptly, his voice strained. "What if we take her somewhere else? Another hospital? Another specialist?" Michael shook his head gently. "You know, we've tried everything. There is no cure, James." The weight of his words filled the room like a suffocating fog. Emily sobbed quietly. James ran a trembling hand through his hair, his body tense with frustration. And then, in the middle of that unbearable silence, a soft whine broke through. Michael turned, finding his loyal German shepherd, Shadow, sitting at the door. The K9 had been with him for years, trained not just as a service dog, but as a therapy companion. Shadow had always been calm, obedient, never entering a patient's room unless invited. But tonight was different. Shadow's ears were perked, his deep brown eyes locked onto Lena. He whined again, shifting his weight as if asking for permission. Michael hesitated before nodding. "Come here, boy." Shadow trotted inside, his large paws making almost no sound against the cold hospital floor. He approached the hospital bed, and to everyone's surprise, gently placed his head on Lena's tiny hand. Emily gasped. He's never done that before. Michael frowned, watching closely. Shadow remained still, his body unusually tense. Then, something happened that sent chills down Michael's spine. Lena moved. It was barely noticeable, a small twitch of her fingers against Shadow's fur. But after days of stillness, it was enough to steal everyone's breath. Michael rushed to check the monitors. A slight increase in her heartbeat. A flicker of activity where there had been none. Emily clutched James's arm. "Michael, what does this mean?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice unsteady. But Shadow did it. The dog let out a soft huff, nuzzling closer, his warm breath brushing against Lena's skin. And then, for the first time in weeks, Lena's lips parted. "Shadow." The room went completely still. Emily covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. James staggered back, gripping the windowsill as if he might collapse. Michael's heart pounded. This wasn't possible. Lena hadn't spoken in days. She had been slipping deeper and deeper into unconsciousness. But now, here she was, responding to a dog's touch. Shadow let out a low, gentle whine, licking her fingers softly, his tail giving the faintest wag. Michael stared at his loyal companion, his mind racing with medical knowledge, with science, with logic. None of it could explain this. But in that moment, none of it mattered. because for the first time in weeks, Lena was still here, and she was fighting. It was all because of Shadow. The hospital room remained frozen in shock. Emily sobbed into her hands, her body trembling as she clung to the miracle unfolding before her. James wiped at his eyes, too stunned to speak. Michael, a man who had spent his entire career believing in logic and medicine, found himself questioning everything he knew. Shadow hadn't moved from Lena's side. His large, warm body was curled next to her tiny frame, his head resting gently on her frail hand. He let out a soft breath, his deep brown eyes locked onto her, as if he understood something no one else did. "Lena," Emily whispered, inching closer to her daughter. "Sweetheart, can you hear me?" Lena's eyelids fluttered. Her breathing was still weak, but more stable than before. She didn't speak again, but her fingers twitched against Shadow's fur, confirming that this wasn't a dream. Michael stepped forward, glancing at the monitors. Her heart rate had improved slightly. It wasn't a drastic change, but it was a change nonetheless, one that had no medical explanation. "I don't understand," James muttered. "We were told there was nothing else that could be done, and now she's reacting." Michael swallowed hard. It's possible that Shadow's presence is triggering something in her brain, maybe an emotional response that's affecting her vitals. Emily looked up, tears still running down her face. "You think she recognizes him?" "She must," Michael admitted. "Therapy dogs have been known to help patients recover. But this is something else." Shadow let out a soft huff, almost as if he was confirming Michael's words. The dog had always been more than just a pet. He had been Michael's partner in countless therapy sessions, helping children with trauma, providing comfort to those who had lost all hope. But he had never reacted to anyone the way he was reacting to Lena now. Michael crouched down beside Shadow, running a hand over his thick fur. "What are you trying to tell us, boy?" Shadow's ears twitched. His gaze never left Lena's face. Then, suddenly, he did something unexpected. He gently nudged Lena's hand with his nose, then looked up at Michael, waiting. It was an instruction. Michael hesitated before carefully taking Lena's frail hand in his. "Lena," he whispered softly, "if you can hear me, squeeze my fingers." For a moment, nothing happened. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, with the kind of hope that bordered on desperation. Then a tiny, almost imperceptible squeeze. Emily let out a strangled sob, grabbing James's arm for support. James inhaled sharply, his body shaking. Michael's throat tightened. "She's responding." Shadow let out a small, satisfied sound, curling closer to Lena as if guarding her from whatever force had been trying to pull her away. Michael quickly checked her vitals again. There was still no drastic improvement, but there was life where there had been none before. And in medicine, even the smallest sign of progress meant hope. Emily pressed a trembling kiss to her daughter's forehead. "Lena, sweetheart, we're here. We're not going anywhere." Michael looked at the parents, knowing he needed to say something. But what? That this was a miracle? That somehow this dog had done what medicine couldn't? Instead, he simply said, "Let's not move him. Let's see what happens if he stays with her overnight." James nodded wordlessly, gripping his wife's hand tightly. Michael turned to Shadow, running a hand down his back. "You knew, didn't you?" Shadow didn't respond. He just rested his head back on Lena's hand, as if he had never doubted her survival. Michael stayed in the room for a while, watching the girl who wasn't supposed to have made it this far, and the dog who refused to leave her side. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in weeks, he believed that Lena might have a chance. And it was all because of Shadow. Morning came too soon. The golden light of dawn spilled through the hospital windows, casting a warm glow on the sterile white walls. Michael rubbed his tired eyes as he stood beside Lena's bed, carefully scanning the monitors. Something had changed. Her oxygen levels were stabilizing. Her pulse was stronger. The shallow breaths that had once sent alarms ringing through the night were now steady and controlled. Michael wasn't the only one who noticed. Emily stirred from the chair where she had spent the night. Her head snapped up the moment she saw her daughter's face. "Lena," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and hope. Lena's eyelids fluttered weakly, then ever so slowly they opened. Emily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. James, who had been dozing in the corner, jolted awake at the sound of his wife's choked sobs. "Lena," Emily repeated, moving closer, desperate to confirm that she wasn't dreaming. The little girl blinked, her lips parting slightly. Her skin was still pale, her body still weak, but the difference was undeniable. "Mommy." The single word shattered whatever restraint Emily had left. She broke into full-bodied sobs, collapsing onto the bed, pressing kisses to her daughter's tiny fingers. James moved beside her, his face crumbling with emotion. He ran a shaking hand over Lena's forehead, as if to confirm that she was truly there, truly awake. "You're okay, sweetheart," he whispered. "You're okay." Michael stood frozen, disbelief warring with relief. He had spent years in medicine. He had seen miracles disguised as coincidences. But this was impossible. His gaze shifted to Shadow. The German shepherd sat motionless by the bed, his dark eyes locked onto Lena. His ears perked, as if waiting for something more. He hadn't left her side, not even for a second. Michael crouched down, running a hand through Shadow's fur. "How did you know?" he murmured. Shadow didn't move, didn't react. He simply kept watching Lena, his tail barely flicking in response. Michael exhaled deeply and turned back to monitors. There was no scientific explanation for this. Yesterday, Lena had been slipping away. Today, she was awake. But the battle wasn't over yet. "Lena," Michael said gently, moving closer. "How do you feel?" The little girl blinked up at him, her lips curving into the faintest smile, tired. Emily let out a breathless laugh, wiping at her wet cheeks. "That's okay, baby, just rest." Michael checked her vitals again. Her condition had improved, but she wasn't out of the woods yet. He cautioned, this could just be temporary. James nodded, his hand tightening around Lena's. "But she's here, and that's more than we had yesterday." Michael turned back to Shadow. The dog still hadn't moved. His gaze was unwavering, intense. "What did you do, boy?" Michael whispered. Shadow exhaled slowly, resting his head on the bed. His body relaxed, but his eyes never closed. He was still watching, still waiting. Emily brushed her fingers through Lena's hair. "Can Shadow stay?" she asked, looking up at Michael. "She seems calmer with him here." Michael hesitated. A hospital room was no place for a dog. But after what had just happened, he nodded. "I think that's a good idea." Emily smiled, reaching out to stroke Shadow's head. "Thank you," she whispered. Shadow gave a slow wag of his tail, but didn't move. Michael stood back, watching the impossible unfold before him. For the first time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, Shadow had done something no doctor could. But in the back of his mind, something unsettled him. Because if Shadow had somehow pulled Lena back from the edge, what had it cost him? The days that followed were nothing short of astonishing. Lena's condition continued to improve. She could now sit up in bed. Her voice was stronger, and her once glassy eyes were now filled with life. Doctors, nurses, even the hospital director stopped by to witness what they were calling a medical anomaly. No one could explain how a child who had been on the brink of death had suddenly begun recovering. But Michael knew, or at least he suspected. Shadow never left Lena's side. Every breath she took, he was there. Every time she stirred, he watched over her. He had become her silent protector, her constant companion, as if he were tethered to her soul. And that's what unsettled Michael the most. Because something was wrong with Shadow. At first, it had been subtle. The German shepherd, always so alert and strong, seemed slower. His movements lacked their usual precision. His tail wagged less. He ate, but not with his usual enthusiasm. And then, last night, Michael had found him lying beside Lena's bed, breathing heavily. His normally bright eyes clouded with exhaustion. It was as if, piece by piece, Shadow was fading. Michael didn't tell Emily or James. They were too focused on Lena's miraculous recovery, and he couldn't bear to steal that hope from them. But deep down, a terrible fear was growing inside him. Shadow had given Lena something more than just comfort. And now, Michael feared the dog was paying the price. That evening, After Emily and James had gone home to rest, Michael sat on the hospital floor beside Shadow, stroking his fur. "You're not okay, are you, boy?" he whispered. Shadow exhaled slowly, resting his head on Michael's lap. "You gave her something, didn't you?" Michael's voice wavered. "Something we don't understand." Shadow's tail barely moved in response. Michael swallowed hard. He had spent years believing in science, in medicine, in the tangible. But now, he was watching something unfold that defied everything he knew. "Is this the price?" he murmured. "You save her and you—" He couldn't say the words. Shadow simply closed his eyes, his body warm and solid against Michael's. A presence, a sacrifice, a love beyond comprehension. Michael clenched his jaw, fighting back the burning in his eyes. He had never felt so helpless in his life. And for the first time, he prayed that he was wrong. Michael didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in the hospital room, watching over both of them. Lena, who had miraculously defied the odds, and Shadow, who seemed to be growing weaker by the hour. The air was thick with unspoken fear. Lena had no idea. She was too busy smiling, laughing, regaining pieces of the life she had almost lost. And Michael didn't have the heart to tell her what he suspected, that the dog who had saved her might be slipping away in her place. Shadow's breaths were slower now, his body unmoving, except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. Michael ran a hand through his fur. "Come on, boy, you have to fight." But deep down, he feared the fight was already lost. Morning came, bringing with it a sense of dread that Michael couldn't shake. Lena was more energetic than ever, sitting up in bed, chatting with the nurses, her voice stronger than it had been in months. Her parents wept with joy. Michael watched in silence. He should have been celebrating too. Instead, his gaze kept drifting to Shadow, who hadn't moved from his spot beside the bed. Something was wrong. Then, just as Lena was laughing at something her father had said, Shadow let out a low whimper. It was so soft that only Michael seemed to hear it. His heart clenched. He dropped to his knees beside the dog, his hands running over Shadow's thick fur, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. "Shadow," his voice was tight with panic. "Come on, boy, look at me." But Shadow didn't lift his head. His breathing was too slow, his body too still. And then, as Michael pressed his forehead against Shadow's, pleading silently, the dog did something that broke him. Shadow licked his hand just once before exhaling one final breath. And then he was gone. The room fell silent. Emily and James turned, confusion etched on their faces. Lena, sensing something was wrong, looked down at her beloved companion. "Shadow," she called softly, reaching out to touch him. He didn't respond. Her small fingers shook him gently. "Shadow, wake up." Michael's throat was tight, his chest aching with grief. He couldn't contain it. He turned away, his fists clenching. Lena's smile faltered. Why isn't he waking up? Emily let out a soft gasp, realization dawning. "Oh, God." James moved quickly, wrapping an arm around his daughter as she shook Shadow harder, tears welling in her bright, innocent eyes. "Shadow, wake up." Her voice cracked, full of fear, of desperation. Michael wanted to speak, wanted to tell her something, anything. That would make this easier, but there were no words for this. Lena looked up at him, her tiny face streaked with tears. "Dr. Carter, what's wrong with him?" Michael swallowed the lump in his throat. He had delivered bad news before, had been in this position more times than he could count. But this was different. "Lena," he said softly, his voice breaking. "Shadow saved you." She sniffled, blinking up at him, confused. "But I'm better now. He's supposed to be okay, too." Michael felt a sharp pain in his chest. He reached out gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. Sometimes, when someone loves you enough, they give you everything they have, even if it means they don't have anything left. Lena shook her head violently. No. He was supposed to stay. He was supposed to be with me." Michael closed his eyes. "I know, sweetheart. I know." But he was gone, and the hospital room, once filled with celebration, was now drowning in grief. The room had never felt so heavy. Lena clung to Shadow's still body, her tiny hands buried in his fur, sobbing so hard her fragile body trembled. Emily knelt beside her, stroking her daughter's back, her own tears falling silently. James stood motionless, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight as he fought the heartbreak of watching his little girl's world shatter. Michael could barely breathe. He had seen loss before, but this was different. This wasn't just a dog. This was the reason Lena was alive. And now he was gone. Lena lifted her tear-streaked face, looking at Michael with wide, broken eyes. Why did he leave me? Michael knelt beside her, his voice barely above a whisper. Lena, he didn't leave you. He gave you his strength. Lena shook her head violently, gripping Shadow tighter. I don't want his strength. I want him back. Her cries echoed to the sterile hospital walls, raw and filled with kind of pain no child should have to bear. Michael's throat burned. He wanted to take away her pain, to tell her something that would make this easier. But there was no easy way to explain the unexplainable. Shadow had done what no doctor, no medicine, no treatment could do. He had saved Lena. And in return, he had given up everything. James turned away, running a hand through his hair, his body tense with suppressed grief. Emily buried her face in Lena's hair, whispering words of comfort between her own quiet sobs. Michael reached out and placed a hand on Lena's small shoulder. He loved you, Lena, more than anything. And love like that, it never really goes away. Lena sniffled, looking down at Shadow's peaceful face. His body was still warm, his fur still soft beneath her fingertips. But he wasn't breathing. He wasn't coming back. She wiped at her eyes. Will he wait for me in heaven? Michael's chest ached. I think he'll always be with you, sweetheart, watching over you. Lena sucked in a shaky breath and nodded. She leaned forward, pressing a final trembling kiss to Shadow's forehead. I love you, she whispered. Shadow didn't move, but somehow it felt like he had heard her. Michael turned his face away, closing his eyes as grief swallowed him whole. Shadow had been his partner, his friend, his family, and now he was gone. But he had left behind a miracle, and for that, Michael would never forget him. The hospital room had never been so quiet. The beeping monitors, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, none of it mattered. The only sound that filled the space was the muffled sobs of a little girl who had just lost her best friend. Michael remained kneeling beside Lena, his hand still resting on her small shoulder. He had no words to offer, no magic solution to mend what had just been broken, because some wounds never fully heal. Shadow was gone, and in his place, he had left behind a little girl who had been given a second chance at the cost of his own life. Lena's small fingers trembled as she ran them through Shadow's fur one last time. He's so warm, she whispered. He shouldn't be gone. He was still warm. Michael swallowed hard. Sometimes love lingers, even when the body is gone. Lena looked up at him, her big, teary eyes filled with confusion. But I don't understand. He was supposed to be okay too. He made me better. So why didn't he get better too? Michael's throat tightened. How could he explain something he himself didn't understand? James cleared his throat, his voice strained. Lena, sweetheart, Shadow was special. He didn't just love you. He saved you. But he didn't have to die, she sobbed. He could have stayed. Emily gently cupped her daughter's face, brushing away the wet streaks on her cheeks. Maybe he did stay, she said softly. Lena sniffled, tilting her head in confusion. Emily turned toward Michael, her voice shaking. You said he gave her his strength, right? Michael nodded slowly. I believe he did. Emily turned back to her daughter, placing a hand over Lena's heart. Then maybe he's still here. Maybe his love is inside you now, keeping you strong, keeping you alive. Lena's lower lip trembled. She placed her small hands over her chest, as if trying to feel what her mother was saying. For a long moment, she stayed silent. Then, finally, she gave the smallest of nods. Will he miss me? She whispered. Michael smiled through his grief. I think he'll always be with you. Lena wiped at her nose, her tiny fingers curling into Shadow's fur for the last time. Then, with slow, hesitant movements, she pulled the blanket over his body, covering the way she had so many times before when they had napped together. Can we bury him somewhere nice? She asked, her voice small and fragile. James nodded. We'll find the perfect place. Lena looked up at Michael. Will you come too? Michael's chest ached. Of course, sweetheart. She nodded, her little fingers still curled into fists, holding on to the only piece of shadow she had left, his memory. The burial was quiet. James and Emily had chosen a peaceful spot on their property, beneath the shade of a towering oak tree. It overlooked a field of wildflowers, where the sun cast golden hues over the landscape. Shadow would have loved it here. Michael stood beside Lena as they laid him to rest, his heart heavy. Lena clutched a single rose in her hands. She was too young to understand the finality of death, but she understood loss. That much was clear. She bent down, placing the flower atop the freshly packed soil. Goodbye, Shadow, she whispered. Thank you for saving me. Tears welled in Michael's eyes, but he blinked them back, placing a firm hand on Lena's shoulder. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves of the great oak tree. It was a soft, gentle breeze, almost like a whisper, like a final farewell. Michael took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. Goodbye, old friend. Days passed, then weeks. Life moved forward, but the absence of Shadow left a hollow space in all their hearts. Michael visited Lena often, making sure her health remained stable. She was stronger than ever, though the sadness in her eyes never fully faded. One afternoon, he found her sitting beneath Shadow's tree, hugging her knees to her chest. You okay, kiddo? He asked gently. She looked up, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in a long time. Peace. You were right, she said softly. Michael frowned. About what? Lena placed a hand over her heart. He's still here. Michael's breath hitched. He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. Yeah, I think so too. Lena smiled, a real, genuine smile. Shadow made me brave. And in that moment, Michael knew Shadow's sacrifice had not been in vain, because Lena was alive. And a hero like Shadow would never be forgotten. There are stories that touch the soul, but then there are stories that carve themselves into the heart, leaving a wound that no time truly heals. This is one of those stories. A tale of sacrifice, of love beyond logic, of a bond so profound that it defied medicine itself. And yet, like all things too beautiful for this world, it came at a cost too great, too painful, too unfair. Shadow was never just a dog. He was never just a companion, never just a protector. He was a guardian, a silent warrior who knew what no one else did. When science gave up, when doctors surrendered to the inevitability of loss, when even a mother's prayers seemed to go unheard, Shadow knew. He saw what others couldn't, felt what even the most advanced machines failed to detect. Lena was slipping away, and there was no cure. But Shadow found one. It wasn't in the form of medicine, nor in the sterile walls of a hospital. It wasn't something that could be studied, replicated, or understood by human minds. It was something purer, deeper, something that had no place in science. Love. The kind of love that gives without hesitation, that sacrifices without question. The kind of love that asks for nothing in return, yet pays the ultimate price. When Shadow curled up beside Lena, resting his head against her frail little hand, he wasn't just offering warmth. He wasn't just comforting a child on the edge of the abyss. He was giving her something. Something no doctor could prescribe, no machine could produce. He was transferring life itself. And it worked. A girl who was supposed to die opened her eyes. A child who had been given no chance whispered a name. A heartbeat that had once been weak found strength. Science called it an anomaly. Medicine refused to explain it. But the truth was simple, undeniable. Shadow saved her. But in doing so, he sealed his own fate. It was subtle at first, the fatigue, the way his body seemed just a little slower, his breaths just a little heavier. No one wanted to see it. No one wanted to believe that the very force that had pulled Lena back from death had somehow stolen from him in return. But deep down, Michael knew. The moment he saw the dullness in Shadow's once bright eyes, the moment he felt the weakness in the body that had once been unshakable, he knew Shadow hadn't just been by Lena's side. He had been replacing her, a life for a life. And when the moment came, when Shadow took that last soft breath, The weight of what he had done came crashing down, like a tidal wave, drowning everyone in grief. The little girl he had fought so hard to save didn't understand why he wasn't waking up. She didn't understand why. After finally being given another chance, she was forced to say goodbye to the one who gave it to her. How do you explain something like that to a child? How do you tell her that the one who loved her the most, the one who stood between her and the darkness, was now gone? Michael tried. He told her Shadow would always be with her. That love like his never truly fades. But what comfort is that to a 6-year-old who had to bury her best friend? What comfort is it to a mother and father who watched their daughter heal, only to watch her heart break into pieces? The world had been unfair to Lena. It had given her pain no child should bear. Stolen time no family should lose. And just when it seemed like she had won, it reminded her that no victory comes without sacrifice. Shadow had saved her, but the world had taken him in return. His grave beneath the great oak tree stood as a testament to the cost of love, a hero buried beneath the earth, gone but never forgotten. Lena sat by that grave, whispering his name, trying to hold on to the warmth of his fur, the steady beat at his heart. And Michael, the man who had always believed in medicine and logic, in things that could be explained, found himself looking up at the sky, wondering if somewhere, somehow, Shadow was still watching. Because heroes like him, they don't just disappear. They live on in the hearts they saved, in the love they left behind, and in the tears of a little girl who would never forget the dog who gave her everything.